Hey everyone, I'm Elliot Voss, and welcome back. Today I've put together a collection of stories that all have one thing in common: trust. The kind that's easy to lose and incredibly difficult to earn back. Some of these people crossed a line they could never uncross. Others were blamed for things that were never their fault. And a few were forced to choose between helping family and protecting themselves. As you listen, ask yourself one question: what would you have done? Because some of these situations don't have a perfect answer. Let's get started with the first story. A ITA for grounding my son after he kept embarrassing my husband during our family vacation? I, 40F, just got back from a 10-day family vacation in Florida with my husband, my 14-year-old son from my first marriage, and my husband's two daughters, who are 12 and 15. For a little background, my son has always been competitive. If there's a game, a race, or any kind of challenge, he's in. He's athletic, picks things up quickly, and genuinely enjoys beating people, especially adults. Most of the time it's harmless and even funny. The problem is, my husband is competitive too. That combination turned out to be a terrible idea. It actually started before we even landed. On the flight, my son found expert-level chess puzzles in the airline's entertainment system and challenged my husband to see who could finish one first. They ended up making a dumb little bet that whoever lost had to buy the winner in-flight Wi-Fi. My husband lost. He laughed, paid for the Wi-Fi, and everyone moved on. Or at least I thought we had. After that, my son decided everything needed to become a contest. Who could swim across the pool first? Who could make it to the top of the resort's rock wall the fastest? Mini golf, the escape room, basketball, even who could carry more beach chairs back from the sand. If there was a way to keep score, he wanted to. The bigger issue was that he kept winning. Every time my husband lost, my son reminded him about whatever little bet they'd made. Sometimes it was ice cream, sometimes arcade credits, a souvenir from the gift shop. Nothing expensive on its own, but after several days it started adding up. At first, everyone laughed. By the fourth day, nobody was laughing anymore. My stepdaughters started getting annoyed because, from their perspective, their dad kept buying things for my son while they got left out. My husband never complained directly, but I know him well enough to tell when something's bothering him. He smiled through it, though each new challenge seemed to wear on him a little more. That evening, I pulled my son aside. I kept the conversation calm. I told him he'd made his point and that it was probably time to ease up. I explained that the constant competitions were creating tension and making the trip less enjoyable for everyone else. He shrugged. Then he should stop saying yes. I told him that wasn't the point. It's not about winning, I said. It's about knowing when to stop. He rolled his eyes like I was giving him another lecture he'd already heard 100 times. The next morning, we were walking toward breakfast when he looked over at my husband and said loud enough for half the sidewalk to hear, "Want to race to the beach? Maybe today's the day you finally beat me." A few people nearby laughed. My husband forced a smile. I didn't. I reminded my son that we'd already talked about this the night before. Without missing a beat, he replied, "I'm not the one who keeps losing." More people laughed. That was the moment I realized this wasn't friendly competition anymore. He wasn't trying to have fun. He was trying to get a reaction. I stopped walking. I told him that if he kept baiting my husband into these competitions after I'd already warned him, there would be consequences. He looked right at me. "You're bluffing." I said, "Try me." He smirked and walked ahead. I don't think he believed I'd actually follow through. He found out I wasn't bluffing. For the next 3 days, every time we left the resort for an excursion, he stayed behind. Before anyone jumps to conclusions, I didn't lock him in a hotel room or leave him by himself all day. The resort was all-inclusive. He still had access to the pool, the arcade, the restaurants, and plenty to do. One of the adults was always close enough to check on him, and we made sure he had everything he needed. The only thing he missed were the outings we'd planned as a family. I'll admit, I expected a huge argument. Instead, he barely reacted. He shrugged, grabbed his headphones, and said, "Whatever." The first day, I almost caved. Part of me wondered if I'd overreacted, but then something unexpected happened. The rest of the vacation felt peaceful. Nobody was trying to turn breakfast into a contest. Nobody challenged anyone to races across the beach. There weren't constant jokes about who was winning or losing. We actually spent time talking instead of keeping score. Even my stepdaughters seemed more relaxed. They stopped competing for their dad's attention because the atmosphere had completely changed. My husband noticed it too. One afternoon, he quietly asked if I thought the punishment had been too much. I told him honestly, I don't know. He nodded. I hate seeing him miss out. So do I. That was the truth. I didn't enjoy punishing him. I wasn't trying to ruin his vacation. I just couldn't keep rewarding behavior that was making everyone else miserable. The funny part is, my husband never once asked me to step in. He never complained. If anything, he kept telling me it wasn't a big deal. But I could see it wearing on him. And more importantly, I could see what it was doing to the rest of the family. When every activity becomes a competition, eventually people stop enjoying the activity itself. They just wait to see who's going to win. By the last day of the trip, my son's attitude had improved. He wasn't thrilled about missing the excursions, but he stopped making comments every time my husband walked into the room. I took that as a good sign. I figured we'd talk everything through once we got home and put the whole thing behind us. I couldn't have been more wrong. A few days after we got back, my ex-husband called. Apparently our son had told him everything. Or at least, his version of everything. He was furious before I could even explain. So you punished him because your husband couldn't handle losing? I told him that wasn't what happened. Not even close. He wasn't punished for winning. He was punished because I repeatedly asked him to stop provoking people and he refused. My ex wasn't interested in hearing that. He was playing games. No, I said. He was humiliating people after they'd already asked him to stop. He's 14. Exactly. Which is old enough to understand when teasing stops being funny. That didn't go over well. He said if anyone needed correcting, it was my husband for continuing to accept the challenges. I told him my husband wasn't the one ignoring repeated warnings. The conversation only got worse from there. By the end of the call, he said he was done being flexible with our custody arrangement. For years, we'd switched weekends whenever it helped everyone's schedule. Now he wanted everything handled exactly according to the court order. No exceptions. Then he mentioned something that completely caught me off guard. He said he was even thinking about revisiting child support because he believed I'd treated our son unfairly. That honestly stunned me. Not because I thought he'd win, because I couldn't believe a disagreement over parenting during a vacation had escalated that far. Since then, the family has been split. Some relatives think I absolutely overreacted and embarrassed my son over something that should have been handled with another conversation. Others think I waited longer than most parents would have, and that he needed to learn there are consequences for repeatedly disrespecting people after being told to stop. I've gone back and forth on it more times than I can count. I keep asking myself the same question. If I'd ignored it, would he have learned that being good at something gives you permission to make other people feel small? Or did I let one bad vacation turn into a punishment that was bigger than it needed to be? That's why I'm here. AITA? I don't think this one is really about who won all those competitions. The real issue is that the son stopped caring whether anyone else was still having fun. There's a big difference between friendly trash talk and constantly trying to embarrass someone. Once a parent has to pull you aside and tell you to knock it off, that's usually the moment to back off, not double down. At the same time, I can see why people are divided. Taking away 3 days of planned excursions isn't a small consequence, especially on a family vacation. Some parents would say it was exactly the wake-up call he needed. Others would argue a shorter punishment or a different approach would have been enough. What really caught my attention, though, was the father's reaction afterward. Instead of focusing on whether his son had crossed a line, the conversation immediately shifted to blaming the adults. That kind of disagreement can turn a parenting issue into a co-parenting issue overnight. I'm curious where everyone lands on this one. Was the punishment fair, or did 3 missed excursions go too far? AITA for refusing to let my brother move back in after what he did to my wife. My wife, 34F, and I, 36M, have been married for 6 years. My younger brother is 31, and until recently I'd have told anyone we were close. We weren't the kind of brothers who talked every day, but if one of us needed help, the other usually showed up. About 8 months ago, he lost his job. Not long after that, he lost his apartment too. He called one evening and asked if he could crash with us for a couple of weeks while he got back on his feet. Before I answered, I talked it over with my wife. She wasn't thrilled about the idea. She likes having people over, but she also likes knowing when they're leaving. My brother has never exactly been known for being organized. Growing up, his room looked like a tornado had picked a favorite place to visit. Still, she agreed. Her only conditions were pretty reasonable: help around the house, respect our space, and actively look for work. He agreed to all of it without hesitation. The first week was easy. Honestly, I thought we'd worried for nothing. He cleaned up after himself, spent most of his day sending out job applications, and even cooked dinner one night to thank us. Then week 2 rolled around. Dirty dishes started piling up in the sink. Food we'd bought for ourselves started disappearing. I'd wake up for work and find him still gaming in the living room at 2 or 3 in the morning. None of it was serious enough to kick him out. It was just constant. Every few days, my wife would mention something. He left his laundry in the dryer again. He finished the coffee and didn't say anything. He promised he'd vacuum. Nothing major on its own, but after hearing the same complaints over and over, they stopped feeling minor. To her credit, she tried talking to him herself before involving me. Every conversation followed the exact same pattern. He'd apologize, promise to do better, spend a day or two making an effort, then drift right back into the same habits. After about a month, my wife sat down beside me one night and said, "I think it's time to give him a move-out date." She wasn't angry, she just sounded tired. I knew she was right. The next evening, I talked to my brother. I told him we'd been happy to help, but it was time for him to start making other arrangements. I gave him 30 days. He surprised me. He didn't argue, didn't get defensive. He actually thanked us for giving him plenty of notice. I remember thinking, okay, this is going a lot better than I expected. If only I'd known what was coming. About a week later, I was at work when my phone rang. It was my wife. The second I answered, I could tell something was wrong. She wasn't crying. She wasn't yelling. She just sounded shaken. She told me one of her afternoon meetings had been canceled, so she'd decided to come home early. When she walked through the front door, she found my brother in the living room, talking to a young couple she'd never seen before. At first, she assumed they were his friends. They weren't. She asked who they were. The couple looked confused. My brother looked even worse. Finally, one of the visitors said they were there to look at the guest room they'd rented for the weekend. My wife thought she'd misheard. They'd what? That's when everything came out. My brother had listed our guest room online as a short-term rental, without telling either of us. He'd convinced himself that since he was already staying there, he could rent the room out on weekends, stay with friends for a couple of nights, and pocket the extra money. He'd already taken a deposit from complete strangers, people he'd invited into our house without asking us. My wife apologized to the couple and explained there had been a misunderstanding. Thankfully, they were polite about it. They left without making a scene. Then she called me. Honestly, when she first told me, I thought there had to be some misunderstanding. It sounded too ridiculous to be real. I left work early and drove home faster than I probably should have. The couple was gone by the time I got there. My brother was sitting at the kitchen table like nothing had happened. I asked him one question. "Tell me this isn't true." He looked down for a second, then nodded. "It's true." I waited for him to explain. Instead, he said something that somehow made the whole situation worse. I was just trying to save money so I could move out sooner. For a second, I honestly thought I was missing part of the story. I asked him to walk me through his thought process. He said since he was already living in the guest room, he figured he could stay with a friend on weekends, rent the room out, and put that money toward his own apartment. I stared at him. You never thought to ask us? I didn't think you'd care. That answer completely floored me. Not because it was believable, because he genuinely seemed to think it was. I asked him if he understood what he'd actually done. He shrugged. I wasn't stealing. No, I said. You invited complete strangers into our home without our permission. I was here. That doesn't make it okay. They weren't dangerous. That's not the point. I could feel myself getting angrier with every sentence. This wasn't about whether those particular people seemed nice. It was about the fact that he'd decided our house was his to rent out, without even mentioning it. I asked how many bookings he'd accepted. He hesitated. Just one. Just one? He nodded. I wanted to see if it worked. That wasn't reassuring. It meant this wasn't some impulsive mistake. He'd thought about it, created the listing, talked to strangers, accepted money, scheduled the visit. Every step required another decision, and at no point did he stop and think, maybe I should ask the people who actually own the house. I took a deep breath. Start packing. His head snapped up. What? You heard me. Ethan, come on. No. He tried a different approach. I was doing this so I could move out faster. You were doing it with our house. I was trying to help everybody. You were helping yourself. The room went quiet. Then he crossed his arms. I think you're overreacting. That was it. Not an apology, not embarrassment, not, I can't believe I did something so stupid. Just, you're overreacting. I looked him straight in the eye. I'm not throwing you out because of the listing. He frowned. I'm asking you to leave because you still don't understand why this is a problem. He didn't say another word. He went upstairs and started packing. By that evening, he'd moved in with a friend. I wish I could say things calmed down after that. Instead, that's when the family got involved. Most of my relatives agreed he'd crossed a line. Even people who usually defended him admitted renting out someone else's guest room without permission was unbelievable. The only exception was my mom. She kept saying the same thing. He wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I told her I understood that. Intentions matter, but so do decisions. She insisted he was desperate. I believed that too. Losing your job and your apartment would make almost anyone panic. Still, being desperate doesn't give you permission to treat someone else's home like it's yours to profit from. Over the next few weeks, she brought it up again and again. He knows he messed up. He won't do it again. He's family. Eventually, she stopped hinting. She came right out and asked if he could move back in. I didn't even have to think about it. No. She sounded disappointed. You're really going to hold one mistake against him forever? I answered as calmly as I could. I'm holding him accountable for one decision that destroyed my trust. There's a difference. Because here's the part I can't get past. Even after everything happened. He still talks like the real problem was that we found out. Not that he ever believed it was acceptable in the first place. That's really what this comes down to. If he'd sat us down afterward and said, I don't know what I was thinking, I crossed a line, and I'm sorry. I honestly believe things would have gone differently. Not overnight, but eventually. Instead, every conversation sounds like he's trying to convince us it wasn't that serious. He says things like, nobody got hurt, or it all worked out in the end. To me, those aren't reassuring statements. They're proof he still doesn't understand why we're upset. The biggest problem was never the money. It wasn't even the listing itself. It was realizing someone I trusted completely looked at my home and decided he had the right to make money from it without asking. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a completely different view of what trust looks like. My wife has been far more patient than I have. She's never told me I can't have a relationship with my brother. She hasn't asked me to cut him out of family gatherings. The only thing she's been clear about is this: she doesn't want him staying in our house again. Honestly, I don't blame her. I wouldn't feel comfortable either. My mom still thinks I'm being stubborn. She says people deserve second chances. Maybe they do. But I don't think anyone is entitled to a second chance in the exact same situation where they already proved they couldn't be trusted. You can forgive someone and still decide not to hand them the keys to your house again. Those aren't the same thing. So, AITA for refusing to let my brother ever move back in? I don't think the biggest issue here is the rental listing. It's the mindset behind it. Think about how many separate decisions it took to get there. He created the listing, talked to potential renters, accepted a deposit, scheduled a showing, and invited strangers into someone else's home. At every step, he had another chance to stop and ask permission. But he never did. What would make this a tougher call is genuine accountability. If he'd immediately admitted he messed up and worked to rebuild trust, I think a lot more people would be willing to give him another shot. Instead, he keeps coming back to the same defense. Nobody got hurt. The problem with that argument is simple. Sometimes the damage isn't physical. It's realizing you can't trust someone the way you used to. I'm interested to hear where you land on this one. If this happened in your home, would you eventually let a family member move back in, or would that trust be gone for good? AITA for canceling my sister's wedding gift after finding out why my wife and I weren't invited. I, 33M, have one older sister, Claire, 36F. We were never the kind of siblings who talked every day, but we've always gotten along. Holidays, birthdays, family barbecues. We'd see each other, catch up, and everything felt normal. That's why this whole situation blindsided me. About a year ago, Claire got engaged. Everyone was excited. My parents jumped right into wedding planning, and I just assumed my wife and I would be there when the invitations went out. We weren't especially close, but there'd never been any bad blood between us. A couple of months passed, and I realized I hadn't heard anything. Then one afternoon, my mom casually mentioned she was going dress shopping with Claire over the weekend. I asked when the wedding was. She looked at me for a second. "You didn't get your invitation?" I laughed. "Not yet." Instead of laughing back, she suddenly looked uncomfortable. She mumbled something about needing to leave and changed the subject so fast it was obvious something was wrong. That was the first time I got the feeling we weren't simply waiting on the mail. A few days later, I called Claire. I honestly expected her to say the invitation had gotten lost or sent to the wrong address. Instead, there was this long pause. Finally, she said, "We had to keep the guest list really small." I accepted that, at least at first. Weddings are expensive. People have budgets. You can't invite everyone. It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was one I could understand. Then social media started filling in the blanks. Over the next couple of weeks, I saw pictures from engagement dinners, bridal showers, and bachelor and bachelorette parties. Cousins I barely knew were posting photos. Family friends I'd met once or twice were tagging Claire. Even people I was pretty sure she hadn't spoken to in years were getting excited about the wedding. The small guest list explanation wasn't making much sense anymore. I tried to ignore it. Maybe there was another reason. Maybe there had been family pressure. Maybe I was reading too much into it. Eventually, I asked my mom if she knew what was really going on. At first, she refused to answer. She kept saying it wasn't her place. After a little more prodding, she finally sighed. "Claire thinks your wife always ends up being the center of attention." I honestly thought she was joking. "What?" She looked embarrassed. "She's been saying it for a while." Apparently, a few years earlier, we'd gone to another family wedding. Several relatives complimented my wife's dress during the reception. Some people spent time talking with her. That's it. Claire somehow decided that meant my wife had a habit of stealing attention from the bride. For the record, my wife is one of the least attention-seeking people I've ever met. She's friendly, easy to talk to. People naturally like her, but she has never tried to make someone else's event about herself. I asked my mom if Claire had actually been telling other relatives this. She nodded. For months. That part hurt more than not being invited. If Claire had simply told me she didn't want us there, at least it would have been honest. Instead, she'd created this fake explanation about keeping the wedding small while quietly telling everyone else a completely different story. Once I knew that, the invitation didn't matter anymore, the honesty did. At that point, I decided I wasn't going to beg for an invitation. If Claire didn't want us there, that was her decision. What bothered me was being lied to. If she just said, "I don't want your wife at the wedding," it would have hurt, but at least we'd all be dealing with the truth. Instead, she let me believe it was about budget while telling other people a completely different story. That's the part I couldn't shake. The only complication was the wedding gift. A few months before invitations were supposed to go out, Claire had asked if I'd build her a custom walnut dining table. Woodworking has been my hobby for years. I've built bookshelves, coffee tables, benches, you name it. I've made pieces for friends, my parents, and a couple of other relatives. Claire had always loved one of the walnut tables I'd built, so when she got engaged, she asked if I'd make something similar for her new home. She offered to cover the cost of the lumber. I told her not to worry about it. I'd make it as my wedding gift. She was thrilled. I was too. It felt personal, the kind of gift that takes time instead of just money. By the time I found out we weren't invited, I'd already bought the walnut slabs. I'd spent a few weekends milling the boards and letting the wood acclimate in my shop. The project had officially started. The morning after I talked with my mom, I walked into the garage, looked at the lumber stacked against the wall, and couldn't bring myself to touch it. I covered it back up and went inside. A week later, Claire called. "How's the table coming?" She sounded completely normal, like nothing had happened. I asked her one question. "Are you really not inviting us?" Silence. Then she sighed. "We've already talked about this." "No," I said. "You told me the wedding was small." "I've since learned that's not the real reason." Another long pause. Finally, she admitted it. "I just don't want the attention on someone else." I laughed, not because it was funny, because I honestly didn't know how else to react. "You really think my wife is going to your wedding to compete with you?" "That's not what I said." "It's pretty close." She started talking about previous family events, how people always complimented my wife, how conversations somehow drifted toward her, how she didn't want to spend her wedding day feeling overlooked. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I said, "I'm not making the table." She went quiet. "What?" "I'm not finishing it." "I thought that was our wedding gift." "It was." The change in her tone was immediate. "So you're punishing me?" I shook my head even though she couldn't see me. "No. I'm matching the relationship you've chosen." She didn't like that answer. She said gifts aren't supposed to come with conditions. I agreed. They aren't. But spending dozens of hours building custom furniture for someone who intentionally excluded my wife doesn't make much sense anymore. She accused me of being petty. I told her maybe she was right, but I also wasn't going to spend months building something that represented love and celebration for a wedding I wasn't welcome to attend. The conversation ended exactly the way you'd expect. Not well. A few days later, my mom called. She asked if there was any chance I'd reconsider. "She's still your sister." "I know." "And she's still getting married." "I know." "Then finish the table." I sighed. "Mom, this isn't about the table anymore." She didn't argue. Instead, she quietly said, "I just hate seeing the family split apart." I understood that. I hated it too. But pretending nothing had happened wasn't going to fix it. Over the next couple of weeks, Claire reached out twice. Not to apologize. Not to explain. Both times she asked the exact same question. "Have you changed your mind about the table?" Neither conversation included the words, "I wish you were coming," or "I'm sorry this happened." Just the table. At some point, I caught myself wondering whether she was more upset about losing her brother at the wedding or losing a handmade walnut dining table she didn't have to pay for. That thought hurt more than I expected. So, AITA for canceling the wedding gift after finding out why we weren't invited? This one got more interesting the longer it went on. At first, it sounds like a simple wedding guest list issue. Couples cut people from weddings all the time because of budgets, venue limits, or family politics. Most people can understand that, even if it stings. But that's not what happened here. The turning point was the explanation. If Claire had simply said, "I don't want your wife there," it probably would have caused an argument, but at least everyone would have been dealing with the truth. Instead, she chose an excuse that fell apart almost immediately, then spent months telling other relatives a completely different story. The table is what everyone will debate, but I don't think that's the real conflict. That table represented dozens of hours of work, planning, and care. Gifts like that usually come from a close relationship. Once that relationship changed, it's not surprising the gift changed too. The part that stood out to me most was Claire calling twice afterward. Not once did she ask if they could repair the relationship. She asked about the table. That says a lot, so I'm curious what you think. If you found out a close family member deliberately left you out of their wedding and lied about the reason, would you still finish a handmade gift that takes weeks to build, or would you put the project away for good? AITA for telling my parents they're free to forgive my cousin, but they can't expect me to. I, 35M, own a small landscaping company. It's not a huge operation, but after almost 10 years of building it from the ground up, it provides a good living for me and my employees. Most of my work comes from repeat customers and referrals, so one thing matters more than anything else: reputation. If people don't trust you, they stop calling. About 2 years ago, my cousin Tyler, 30M, reached out looking for work. He'd been bouncing between jobs for years and said he wanted a fresh start. My parents immediately started encouraging me to hire him. He's family. He just needs someone to believe in him. Against my better judgment, I agreed. I brought him on as an entry-level crew member. To his credit, he started off great. He showed up early, worked hard, and fit in with the crew almost immediately. A few months later, I trusted him enough to handle estimates for smaller residential jobs while I focused on our larger commercial contracts. Looking back, that was probably my biggest mistake. The first sign something was wrong came from one of my oldest customers. He called sounding confused. "Can you explain why my final invoice is almost $2,000 higher than the estimate?" I apologized and assumed we'd made a paperwork mistake. When I pulled up the file in our system, though, everything looked normal. The estimate on my computer matched exactly what we'd agreed on. So where had the other number come from? I asked the customer to email me the copy he'd received. The estimate looked almost identical to ours. Same logo, same formatting, same job description, just different numbers. Someone had increased the total. At first I thought maybe an old version had accidentally been sent. Then another customer called. Same problem, different amount. That wasn't a coincidence anymore. I started digging through old paperwork, comparing emails, checking payment records. Eventually, the whole thing unraveled. Tyler had been creating fake estimates with inflated prices. Customers believed the higher amount was legitimate. He'd tell them they could pay the difference directly to him because it was easier than processing another invoice through the office. They trusted him because he worked for me. That money never made it into the business. It went straight into his pocket. I just sat there staring at my computer. It wasn't only the money. Some of these customers had been with me for years. If they thought I'd been overcharging them, everything I'd built could disappear almost overnight. I called Tyler into the office that afternoon. I gave him every opportunity to explain. Instead, he denied everything, even with the paperwork sitting right in front of him. He insisted someone else must have changed the estimates. I slid 2 copies across the desk, one real, one fake, side by side. Explain the differences. He couldn't. The silence lasted almost a full minute. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. I was going to pay it back. I stared at him. With what? He didn't answer, because we both knew there wasn't an answer. That was the moment I realized I wasn't dealing with one bad decision. I was dealing with a pattern. One customer would have been a mistake. Several customers meant he'd been doing this for weeks, maybe months. I fired him on the spot. He started arguing immediately, said I was overreacting, said I was ruining his life. I remember looking at him and thinking, you actually believe I'm the one doing this to you? That conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. He left angry. I stayed behind trying to figure out how much damage he'd actually done. The next few weeks were brutal. I spent almost every day calling customers I'd worked with for years. Some of those conversations were easy, others weren't. Imagine getting a phone call from the owner of a company telling you one of his employees had been skimming money from your project. A few people appreciated the honesty. A few assumed I was only admitting it because I'd been caught. Honestly, I couldn't blame them. If the roles had been reversed, I probably would have wondered the same thing. Anyone who'd paid extra got a full refund. No arguments, no excuses. If Tyler stole the money while wearing my company shirt, then fixing it was my responsibility. Financially, we survived. Reputations don't recover that quickly. A couple of longtime customers never called us again. That hurt. Not because of the lost income. Because we'd spent years earning their trust and it disappeared because I trusted the wrong person. Tyler disappeared after that. For months, the only updates I got came from relatives. Apparently, he'd been crashing with friends, picking up temporary jobs, and telling anyone who would listen that I'd overreacted. According to him, I'd ruined his future over a few mistakes. I stopped paying attention. There wasn't much else I could do. Then, about 8 months later, my parents invited me over for Sunday dinner. Nothing about the invitation seemed unusual. We'd done family dinners for years. I showed up expecting lasagna and football. Instead, I walked into an ambush. Dinner started normally enough. We talked about work. My dad complained about his golf game. Mom asked whether I'd finally taken a weekend off. Then, halfway through dessert, she looked at me and said, Tyler wants to apologize. Before I could answer, the back door opened. Tyler walked in. I hadn't known he was coming. Nobody had mentioned it. He pulled out a chair and sat across from me. I've had a lot of time to think. I didn't say anything. He kept going. I know I messed up. I've changed. I just want the family to move forward. I listened. Then he took a breath and finally got to the real reason he was there. I was wondering if you'd consider giving me my job back. For a second, I honestly thought I'd misheard him. You're serious? He nodded. I just need another chance. I looked around the table. My mom wouldn't meet my eyes. My dad suddenly became very interested in his coffee. That's when I realized they'd known exactly where this conversation was going. I turned back to Tyler. Why would I hire someone who stole from my customers? I was desperate. You were dishonest. I said I was sorry. I heard you. But those aren't the same thing. He leaned forward. No one else will hire me because of what happened. I nodded. I know. That's exactly what consequences look like. He looked over at my parents, almost like he expected them to step in. My mom did. Everyone deserves a second chance. I took a deep breath. I don't disagree. But a second chance doesn't have to come from me. She frowned. He's family. So were the customers he stole from. The room went completely quiet. Tyler spoke up again. I've learned my lesson. I asked him one question. How much money did you take? He blinked. I don't know. Roughly. I'm not sure. That answer told me everything. If he'd really spent months thinking about what he'd done, how could he not know? How could he not have added it up? How could he ask for forgiveness without even understanding the full amount of damage he'd caused? At that moment, I realized he wanted another opportunity. He still wasn't taking full responsibility. Those aren't the same thing. I pushed my chair back. I love you both. I looked at my parents. But you should have told me he was coming. Neither of them answered. I grabbed my keys and walked out. The drive home was quiet. I wasn't angry that Tyler had asked. I was angry that my parents had decided I needed to have that conversation without giving me a choice. That part hurt almost as much as what Tyler had done. The next morning, my mom called. I almost let it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. I didn't appreciate being blindsided. I know, she said quietly. I should have told you. I waited. I just thought if you two were in the same room, maybe things would be different. They weren't. She sighed. I know. For a minute, neither of us said anything. Then she asked the question I'd been expecting. So that's it? What do you mean? You're never going to forgive him? I thought about that for a second. I didn't say that. Then what are you saying? I'm saying forgiveness and trust aren't the same thing. She didn't respond, so I continued. If I forgive him someday, that's for me. But trusting him with my business again? I shook my head, even though she couldn't see it. That's a completely different decision. She sounded disappointed. I just don't want this hanging over the family forever. Neither do I. But pretending it never happened won't fix it. After we hung up, I sat in my office for a long time thinking about that conversation. People love talking about forgiveness. They don't spend nearly as much time talking about rebuilding trust. Those aren't interchangeable. One is a decision. The other has to be earned. About a month later, Tyler reached out himself, not to ask for his job back, just to meet for coffee. I almost said no. Instead, I figured one conversation couldn't hurt. We met at a small diner halfway between our houses. He looked different. Tired, older. Life had clearly been rough on him. After a few minutes of awkward small talk, he looked at me and said, I owe you an apology. I nodded. You do? I've spent months blaming you. He looked down at his coffee. It was easier than admitting I did this to myself. That was probably the most honest thing I'd ever heard him say. Then he reached into his backpack and slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a cashier's check. It wasn't enough to cover everything he'd taken. Not even close, but it wasn't $10 either. It was the first payment. I know it doesn't fix anything, he said. It's all I could save. I looked back at him. For the first time, this actually feels like you're taking responsibility. He gave a small nod. I finally added it all up. I remembered the question I'd asked him at my parents' house. How much money did you take? Back then, he didn't know. Now he did. There was a long silence before he spoke again. I'm not going to ask for my job back. I smiled a little. That's probably a good decision. He actually laughed. Yeah. I figured. We talked for another half hour. For the first time since everything happened. It felt like we were having an honest conversation instead of an argument. When we got up to leave, he stopped me. I know you'll probably never trust me again, I answered honestly. I don't know. He looked surprised. I really don't. I slipped the envelope into my jacket. But I do know this. You finally understand why you lost it. He nodded. I do. As I drove home, I realized something. My parents had spent months asking me to forgive Tyler. What they never understood was that forgiveness had never been the hardest part. The hard part was waiting for him to accept what he'd actually done. Only then did it feel like there was something worth rebuilding. I still won't hire him again. And I don't think I ever will. Not because I hate him, not because I want revenge, but because my employees, my customers, and the people who've trusted me with their homes deserve better than another gamble. My parents think I'm too stubborn. Tyler says he understands. Maybe he really does now. So, IITA for telling my parents they're free to forgive my cousin, but they can't expect me to trust him with my business again? I think this story shows why people often confuse forgiveness with reconciliation. They're not the same thing. If Tyler had apologized the day he got caught, I probably would have questioned whether he was sorry for what he did or just sorry he got caught. The fact that he came back months later with a partial repayment and admitted he'd been blaming everyone else feels much more genuine. But even then, should that automatically earn him his old job back? I don't think so. Owning a business means you're responsible for more than family relationships. You're responsible for your employees, your customers, and the reputation you've spent years building. One bad hiring decision can affect people who had nothing to do with the original mistake. What I liked here is that the ending isn't about revenge. The cousin isn't treated like he's beyond redemption, and the owner isn't portrayed as cold or heartless. They finally have an honest conversation, but honesty doesn't erase consequences. Here's the question I'd ask you. If someone sincerely proves they've changed, does that mean they deserve another chance in the exact same role where they broke your trust? Or can forgiveness exist without restoring that opportunity? Thank you so much for spending your time with us and listening to these stories. We hope they gave you something to think about, made you see a situation from a different perspective, or simply entertained you for a while. Now we'd love to hear from you. Which story stayed with you the most? Did you agree with the decisions people made, or would you have handled things differently? Share your thoughts in the comments. We read them all, and some of the best discussions happen there. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel reach more people who enjoy Reddit stories just like you. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next collection of real-life stories and thought-provoking discussions. Thanks again for watching, take care of yourself, and we'll see you in the next video.